So no slides tonight. I'm just going to run you through as much code as I can handle in the next 25 minutes, I think. So I'm doing, well, first there's lots of new faces since I was here last. So I'm glad to be back in San Diego. I've missed you guys. For the people who have still been around, San Francisco's nice, but it's just not the same. I took two. I took Tom and I took Chris. And Toby was in Orange County, so he doesn't count. Yeah. But you've grown, so don't worry about it. Yeah, I still count San Diego RB as home, so, it's nice. Okay, so, 4 little tiny talks. Merb is a JSON-RPC service, God, gem to RPM, and heckle. So, first off, Merb. Who's played with Merb? Who's not familiar with? Well, who's played with Merb? I showed you. Who is unfamiliar with Merb? Okay. So, Merb is Ezra Zygmuntovich's Ruby web framework. The name comes from the fact that initially it was truly just ERB and Mongrel. This is really incredibly stripped down Rails, basically. It's thread safe. It's very tiny. There's very little overhead. It's about as close to the metal you can get without writing a Mongrel handler for a web app. And it's really nice for writing JSON-RPC services. And we've got several at work. The one I'm going to show you tonight actually handles all of the merging and inverting for our index. I'm working in a search engine company, and we've got to handle lots of machines doing lots of different things, and this is one of the brain centers. And it's 74 lines in the controller. And I think there's some model code that handles logging in and sending commands, but I think altogether there's probably 150 lines of logic. And one of the reasons that it's so nice to write things, write this stuff with Merb, is, well, one, if you pass a proper content type, Merb will take all of your parameters, which are JSON, because you're dealing with the JSON service, and put them in the params hash, just like you would with a normal Rails app if you're working on a GET request or a POST request. So that's nice. And additionally, because the methods in Merb all return strings, whatever you've returned on at the end of the method, which in this case is the result of the handle call, it means that you can not have to deal with templates, you can deal with the strings themselves and coerce them however you'd like. So basically the brain center of the JSON stuff is this little plugin I wrote, about 50 lines, which handles passing around JSON in nice ways. So I provide a way to wrap a JSON error, a JSON result. Now notice these are actually Ruby hashes. This is because at the end of our method handle, we run two after filters. We set JSON as the content type, and we coerce the response to JSON. So any strings we've returned, any integers, any hashes will automatically be coerced from their Ruby form straight to the JSON form. So we don't have to think about that. It just happens. This is the entirety of sort of our event handler, I guess, is how I like to think about it. We make sure that we're dealing with a method that we've defined somewhere. Otherwise we return a JSON error. And otherwise we call this handle method, which is kind of ugly. In later forms, this is some early code. We've actually designed a simple DSL to define both what methods we're working with, what their return types are, and additionally what they do as a proc. So for the simple case, when we're calling this method over JSON-RPC, VPU get capabilities, all we do is return this Ruby hash. It's constant every time. And so what happens is we hit index, it sees that it's in the method signatures, we call handle passing in the parameters, Is the text big enough for everyone, or should I bump this up? Yell out if you need it larger. Bigger would be good. Better? Okay. We call handle, and we get to get capabilities, and it returns this Ruby type, or this Ruby hash, which then gets returned, and we set the content type and we coerce the response to JSON, and that's about as complicated as it gets. Everything else is able to be handled in our data model. So you can write really stripped down JSON-RPC 1.1 services, which require that the transport is HTTP, so you need a web server anyway. And initially some people tried to hack this onto Rails, and you can do it. There's just a lot more than what you need. We're not using any templating. We're not doing any HTML. We don't need active support. This is literally pull data in, do something, pass it out, nothing else. So Merb has been really nice for that because it's ridiculously fast, especially in comparison to Rails. I think there's a 2 or 3 times speed up. We can thread it and it's nice to work with. So that's Merb with JSON-RPC. Are there questions before I go on to whatever my next slide was, or next talk was? Rob. I haven't actually compared it to camping. You've got a lot of dynamic things happening. Ezra's design has been really, really simple. He avoids cleverness in a lot of ways, and where we found it. Yeah. Like the routing code is like 110 lines. Rails routing code is over 1,000 and builds up strings which are then evaled. Merb's is a lot simpler. Yeah, don't dive in the routing code. Only Jameis and Nick Sackar can do that. It can use ERB. I think there's also support for Hamel or Markaby or yeah. Yeah. I'm not actually sure if it's loaded if I'm not calling render. It likely is, but it's never called. It takes my string and courses that back into a response. So here I'm actually, when I was writing this, Ezra was changing the internal so you couldn't access, or so that you could access status as a method, and he was sort of hiding body, so this is a little weird. But here we're actually grabbing the response body and changing that as an after filter. So we never actually touch a templating system. Yeah, it's an explicit thing, which is one of the things that makes it nice for services. It's a nice way to pass around HTTP stuff, which can also be used for web apps, but doesn't necessarily need to be. Okay, other questions about Merb or JSON-RPC or the two of them working together? Cool. Okay, so what did I say I was going to do next? Oh, God. So, how many people have seen God? God the software monitoring tool. Okay, so we got one. Well, this will be fun. This is something that Tom Werner, who's also a San Diego RB guy, or was. I know his heart's still here. He said to say hello, by the way. He got angry at Monet's config file one day and wrote God. And God keeps track of your processes and keeps them alive. And it's currently running gravatar.com. And a couple weeks later at work we said, hey, this is really cool. We're gonna adopt it. So what started as a very simple, is my process alive, let's keep it up thing, has sort of grown, and we're working on making it a full monet replacement, with a bunch of added features. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is show a few sample config files, because it really exhibits what you can do with God well. So let's start with a simple one. So, this syntax is going to be in the next major release, which is probably next week. This is slightly different. It's a simplification in some ways of the old version, and also allows us to easily do separate config files for different processes. So that we can reload those on the fly. So we say that God, our process, is going to watch, something. In this case, we're doing a simple server. I think the server in this case was simply a loop that said, I'm alive every 10 or 15 seconds. We haven't described how to stop it in this case. We just want to keep it up. And the interval, this is a polling interval. So, we want to check every 5 seconds to see if the server is alive. We set a grace, can't think of the word. We wait 2 seconds, grace interval, for 2 seconds, so that we say we're going to start the service and then we're going to check and see if it's online, so you don't just keep trying it over and over and over. And then here's the part that says we want it to be alive. We're going to start this service if the condition process running evaluates to false. And that's all you need to keep a basic server up. You could actually remove grace. But that's about as simple as God gets in the simple case. But the simple case isn't the reason to use God. Though honestly I find this a lot nicer than Monet's, English-ish config file. Really the reason you want to do it is that when things get more complex, God can handle it, no problem. So, let me bump this down. So, for example, here we've got additional things like, restart and, the restart and stop grace. But, additionally, here's the things that you're gonna see. This is the pseudo advanced config file. So we can describe things like behaviors, where we want something to happen before or after an action. In this case, we're using a built-in one called clean PID file. So there was a gem, Rob, do you remember which version of Mongrel didn't clean up its own PID files, so Monet would freak out? Yeah, it was like 1.0. And you had to upgrade, Mongrel cluster, the Mongrel cluster gem, which would then take care of the PID files. Otherwise things would go wrong, and Monet didn't know what was going on. So, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's not nice. So in this case, we say, for this thing we're watching, we want to clean up the PID file. When you see it's dead, remove the PID file before trying to start it. This shouldn't be an issue. It should just work. And here in the last one, you saw this start if call. Well, if you want to get a little more complex, you can deal with the actual transitions, because, at the heart of this is a state machine. We're going from down to up and restarting if we need to and things like that. So we say, for our initial transition, if the condition process running is true, then we move to the up state. If it's false, then we go to the start state, and the start state is what will start your process. If you're in start or restart, and the process running is true, then we go to up. So the start action has been called. Now it sees, okay, the process is alive. I need to move to the up state, which will then be able to do this. So up will go to start if the process exits. So this is a feature we haven't seen in the other config file. Process exits is actually an event-based condition. So what happens is on BSD or Darwin, it uses KQ to say, I'm paying attention to this process. When it dies, send me a signal and I'll evaluate a block, which in this case is running start. So as soon as the process exits, it will restart your thing instead of having to poll every 5 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever your interval is. It just does it at the instant that it's killed. So from up we go to start if that happens. I'm sorry, on Darwin and BSD it uses KQ. On Linux it uses the netlink connector. And to use that you need to have the module is called CN. I don't recall what I believe it's called connector in kernel config. So it's either got to be in the kernel or you need to load the module. And because of the way, or because the socket has to have root privileges, you have to run God as root to get the event-based stuff on Linux. Which may or may not be a problem. In this example, we're actually setting the UID and the GID, so we probably need root permissions anyway. If you're not using the event-based stuff, we're not requiring you to run God as root. It'll run without it. You just can't use the event-based stuff. I currently in 0.2, it will be, if you try to do it, it will be unhappy with you. In the new version, I put in a fix and it'll just raise an exception, but only if you try to call that. Like if the event, if you call register on the process, which happens through the config file, then it will raise an error, but otherwise you should be good. Yeah. It can also handle things like memory usage, CPU usage, pretty standard for a monitoring tool. And again, these are a little more complex, but and it really, I think, again, this is nicer than Monet's config file. But the place where God really shines is when you need it to do something that it doesn't already do. It's really hard to modify Monet because it's in C and it uses this grammar for a pseudo English language. So if you want to change something in the config file, you're going into you're changing the grammar in Yak, and it's a big pain. So someone sent this in today, actually. This is from a guy who really gets the usefulness of God, I think. In this case, he's using God to start everything. He's using Ruby all over the place to set up variables and conditions. He defines his own behavior. So I should bump this up. So he defines his own behavior. If you remember in the last code snippet you saw clean PID file, which can happen before or after a transition state. In this case, he defined an email alert, which we're actually planning to roll in one of our own soonish. But this is the entirety of his behavior. He says before start, we're going to send off this SMTP message notifying, and before restart, it calls the same thing. So you get notified every time it started or restarted. And he just extended this right in the config file. It's 20 lines. And that's pretty cool. Let's see. Additionally, because we're working with Ruby, you can define all of your own helpers in the config file. So here he decided that he had a set of default handlers that he wanted all of his services to use. He wanted to do the default process running stuff, and restart, up to start if it's false. And so he defines this helper method. And then later, you'll notice he's actually iterating over port numbers that he's starting mongrels up on, and different Rails environment configurations. He calls default handlers, which brings all of the common stuff in. So he's not repeating himself in the configuration file, and he can easily generate large configs with very little code. You're getting all the good stuff in Ruby for free. And it's really easy to extend the system. So just ferret. Are there other things he was using in here that I wanted to show off? No, I think that's the meat of it. But, this is a great example of why God is going to be good to work for. Yeah, I think I'm going to. Tom just sent it to me while I was sitting on the couch in the coffee house today. So we're excited people are getting it. Nice. Well, I guess it depends how he has SMTP set up. You're right, he's doing it before start and before restart. Maybe he should do it after. Because then it's up, and then you can send it. Yeah, that works too. So stuff that's coming. We're going to be doing more event stuff. So file notifications. You'll be able to watch a directory and say, when this file gets this large, or when this directory gets this large, rotate your logs. When a new file shows up in this directory, it's a core dump. Send us a notification. Better notification stuff in general. Right now, there's not much built in. He rolled his own. But the exciting thing for me is the event stuff, and it's really easily extendable, and that's nice for a monitoring tool. So, are there questions about God? Rob.
Since you're pulling for all this stuff anyway, you could easily keep track of the stats, and then have a separate tool that generated, a nice little, for instance, if you're watching the CPU load, you have to access it anyway. If you write it down, our R&D tool can go back and make you a nice pretty CPU graph.
Yeah, it's certainly something we've thought about. Right now, God can optionally run a DRB server. So that you can access stats that way. Chris Wanstrath, from Air the Blog. And we're gonna be moving forward there. This is actually what I'm working on most at my day job. So, it's hitting the wish list and getting those things done. I think most immediately next is getting us basically feature complete with Monet, being able to reload configuration files while it's running. You can start and stop individual services now. What else is on the list? I think that's most of what's happening. Tom may be finishing those things this week. He was working on it most of the week, and I was all last week, so.
Do you recommend having one God process plus another God process?
We've actually talked about this. I don't know. It hasn't been tried. If you do it, tell me. Yeah. I don't know. Theoretically, you could. It could probably be done. If the only thing I think that would keep you from doing that right now is if they both try to open syslog at the same time. I'm not sure what would happen. But if that could be configurable, then I don't think there's a reason you wouldn't be able to. Yeah, it really shouldn't. You're right. So that it's not a problem. You're right. Yeah, I think it would work. I haven't tried it. Yeah, right now the memory overhead is only about 6 megs. So, I mean, there's not a real reason you couldn't do it. Yeah, actually, in trunk, the daemonization is slightly broken. but there's just a God binary, which I think in 0.2.0, uses the daemon, Ruby gem to daemonize itself. In the new version, since, this is cool, I didn't mention this. If you don't supply a PID file in the configuration, it will assume you want God to monitor it, or to deal with it, and it will fork exec and set the PID file on its own and be able to track that by itself. So you don't need to, I think Tom wrote a blog post a couple months ago about using daemons to make your little services, monet happy. You don't have to do that with us, because if you don't set the PID file, it'll just do it for you. Yeah, so you just say this is where the PID file is. And, in saying that, I've completely forgotten your question. Can you? Oh, yeah, there's just a script that's tossed into your bin directory, and it's God start, God stop. It's just like monet. No. It was, I think it was initially, but we're ripping that out. It's not in trunk right now. So are there other questions?
So you said you could shut down individual processes, so would you call it same binary?
You'd say like God stop mongrel 8001, or God stop MySQL, or same as monet. That works well. Testing and debugging the configuration file or God itself? We haven't actually tested these. So far, if what I would do probably is start it up, start killing processes, and see if stuff happens correctly. But besides unit testing, that's the way we've done integration tests, I guess you could call them. Start it up, see if it does the right thing. I'm not sure how I would go about doing automated tests for the configuration file, or if I would.
Does God currently have the ability to hit ports to see if things are all responding?
It doesn't, but writing the condition would be trivial. In fact, let me show you one of the conditions, because this again is one of the points. I can't actually see over there. It's in lib God conditions. So here is process running. So here's the whole condition. It checks to make sure that you're setting. My trunk may actually be out of date, because I don't believe you need to set PID file for process running anymore. But here's you've got two methods, valid and test. Valid says you may need to pass in certain things to this condition from the block for any of this to make sense. And here's the test. So if we return the boolean self.running unless the PID file exists, and then if the PID file is there, we read the ID and strip it out, and then we check to see if it exists. I think it's using PS it's using kill-0 in this case. And then we return a true-false value, depending on whether it's up or not. So it doesn't do it yet, but it's really, really easy to implement, which is half the point. We wanted something we could extend, ad infinitum. Other questions? Okay, well that's God. What was the next thing? Oh, gem to RPM. So, who uses a Linux distribution that has its own packaging system? Who's had that moment where you're like, oh my god, I wish Gem was in my packaging system, or my packaging system was in Gem, or they could talk to each other, or the MySQL gem knew that MySQL was there, or, you can, yeah, I mean, yeah. So that sucks. So at work, we didn't want to do that, so I wrote a system that would easily convert gems to RPMs. It's 3 150-line scripts. Some of it use some of our internal build tools. But as soon as someone jumps up and down and says, yes, I'd like it, my boss has told me to open source it. We want to get it out there if people want to use it. It's incredibly useful to us. So, let me show you convert gem. So again, we're gonna run over a little bit of code. Let me show it to you first. So here we've got our God package. We do gem to RPM god.gem. So I said there were 3 sets of scripts. They actually all run on different levels. So gem to RPM is the lowest level. It takes a single gem and converts it to an RPM, making sure dependencies are there and setting them properly. On top of that is convert all gems, which takes a directory of gems, makes sure they satisfy each other's dependencies and builds them all in the right order so that you're good. And then there's convert gem, which you pass it a name, it goes to the Ruby4 YAML index, downloads all of the gems you don't already have, and converts them in the right order using convert all gems. So we're looking at the lowest level right now. Since I don't have net access, I'm not going to show off convert gem, but just we've got like 115 gems in our repo. Just take it as given that it actually works. So gem to RPM, it goes through and uses some of our packaging stuff. So things you're going to see going by, it's checking to see if RubyGem daemons, RubyGem ho, Ruby and Ruby gems are all installed and that they've got the correct versions. It's just staged the gem into a staging directory, and there's our RPMs. And now we're done. And now we can yum install it or RPM install it, and that's it. And in this case, this one is i386 Darwin dependent, so it'll make Arch packages or no Arch packages, depending on what you need. And this is how I don't pull out my hair when we need a new gem in the system. So there's a couple of cool things in the code I wanted to show off. One is that I'm using Rake as a programming tool in this case. So the big thing that gem to RPM deals with is dependencies, right? You've got to build things in the right order, and they've got to be able to all be in the right place. So what actually happens is we go through this that's convert gem. Oh, yes. So we're looking at convert gem. It downloads all of the gems and then builds them in the right order. So what it does is we go to this YAML index, we say, what are all your dependencies? Based on those dependencies, we boil them down into some strings and build up basically this big hash of packages to dependencies. And then we iterate through them and say we're going to create a rake task for each one of these. And let me bump this up for you. So we're going to create a rake task for each one of these packages. And they depend on the names of all of the other packages. And then we have this block, which is the task, where we make sure that it's either installed or we try to install it and see if it's in the repo somewhere. So that we don't go ahead and convert every gem you need every time. If you've got it or you can install it, it'll do that first. And then if that all fails, it uses curl to grab the gem, and that's how the dependency web works. It makes sure that all of the lower level dependencies are there, or it downloads them. So then after setting up these rake tasks, it goes through and rejects all the ones that are dependencies of something else. So we don't need to rerun those twice. We just need to execute the minimum number of tasks in order to get this to work, because all of our dependencies are set up. So then once it rejects those, I should actually probably split this up into different lines. But once it rejects those, it goes ahead and invokes each task it doesn't actually matter what order you run them in, because they're not dependencies. They'll deal with the tree. And that's it. I don't have to deal with anything else. Rake does it for me. So, it's not it's not a rake file per se, but, when it comes down to it, if you want to boil it down to the simplest thing, it's basically a big rake file. Yeah, it's a meta rake file. It generates itself, which is kind of neat. Yeah. So, if you're doing dependency management in Ruby, rake can be really nice. The only issue, I actually started writing a simple, task dependency server using rake and Merb, and the only issue I came across, which I think can be worked around, is that rake kind of keeps this global list of all of the tasks around. So when you need to flush things, you've got to flush this global cache or deal with multiple copies and passing them around. But if you're doing simple things where it doesn't matter, and you can do do things serially and set up all your dependencies and then clear them out, this works really well. So that's gem to RPM and friends. Are there questions? Okay. I think the last thing was heckle. Who is familiar with heckle? Who is not familiar with heckle? Okay. So, if you think the rake task blew your mind, Jordan, heckle is, well, let's think about it this way. How many people have seen Sneakers, the movie? Wow, that's drastically few. Okay, so sometimes banks hire burglars to try to break into their systems to see what works. Similarly, many computer companies will hire penetration testers that'll try to hack their system. Heckle is sort of the equivalent for your tests. It goes in and smashes up your code and makes sure your tests fail. Because the idea is that it modifies literals, branches, things like that. So the idea is if you flip an if, or you make a call, return some random value, or you change strings to random things and increment numbers, something should probably go wrong. And if it's not going wrong, you should probably look at it. So if you're doing thorough testing or just interested in seeing what's not being tested and you want to go a little more in depth, than something like Archive, which does line by line analysis, that's what heckle does. So, I guess the best way to show what it does is to show it in action. So, that Merb JSON server that you saw earlier, which here it is. So that JSON server you saw earlier, has some unit tests. Both for the controllers and the model. So what I'm going to do is run heckle against it. In this case, this is sort of a slightly more complicated command than you may normally see. It's generally just heckle and then the class name, but it has to know where to find the tests. And since this is in sort of a non-standard location, it's not a Rails app, and it's boiled down, I need to tell it where the tests belong. So we say heckle, this is where my tests are, this is the class I want you to deal with. Then you hit enter, and you get all this crap back. So this is going through and finding all of the things that can possibly mutate, changing them, running your tests to see if they pass or fail, and then reverting them to the original code. This is all happening at runtime on the fly. There's something similar for Java called Jester. It only does, I think it does 4 different mutations. It makes if statements always branch one way or the other, and it increments numbers. And I think that's it. Right now, heckle does strings, if, unless, while, numbers, regexes, ranges, calls. There might be something else. It does a lot. And so it's really thorough. So what you've seen happen here is, let's copy and paste this into another system so that we can read the diff in a sane way. So we loaded this handle method with 25 possible mutations. It ran through all of them and reported that these ones caused test failure, or didn't cause test failures. So I'm going to put this into TextMate so it's a little easier to read. Okay, so here's our diff. It takes our method and it's changed these two lines. So, when we call select values, it changes our select string to gibberish. And it's not failing. So what this means is somewhere I've forgotten to test that select values is actually working. Odds are I'm probably using a mock to say I expect you to call select values. Or maybe I've just forgotten to do it for this method. And this is how we find that this isn't being tested, even though the line may be executed. It likely is. But this specific part was not tested. Similarly, here we can see, okay, that's not going to paste well. Anyway, here we can see that if we change this string, hasn't been implemented yet, we get all of this stuff back. Or change it to this, we don't get a failure. And both of these cases may not matter so much. Where it matters more is, let's see what I can change that won't break my test. You know what? Let's pull out a test. So, let's say I take out this test, that we're actually getting the correct value back. So here we test that the method is actually there, that we're returning a success. But here we don't test what the result was. So, if we pull that out and rerun heckle, we should get one more test failure, or one more mutation failure, I expect. So there's the first one, there's the second one. Here we go, here's our third one. So in this case, we are executing the code, but we've actually forgotten to test what the result was. So a line-based tester like arcov, will not tell you you're not testing this. Even though in this case this is a vital part of the application. We're getting something back, but it's not what we expected. And that's a problem. So, heckle shouldn't necessarily run clean for every app. It's really, really brutal. There's some things you probably want to ignore. There's some strings that can be modified that you probably don't care about. But it can find a lot of things that other types of code coverage tools can't. So it's useful for looking at your code. Is anybody interested in well, this always goes over the heads of most people because it took me 2 days to understand what was going on. Is anybody interested in how heckle uses the parse tree to modify S expressions to change all of this on the fly? Because if not, that's okay, because I talk about it too much. Yell out if you're interested, because otherwise I'm going to skip it. Okay, good. No S expressions. Find me afterwards. Yeah, so heckle is pretty cool. The props should go out to Ryan Davis and Eric Hodel, Ryan had the initial implementation of heckle at RubyConf last year, which flipped ifs. And then I sort of rewrote it on the plain home. But Ryan and Eric wrote parse tree in Ruby to Ruby and all of the tools that heckle builds on top of. So it couldn't be around without them. And they're the other two major contributors. So that's heckle. I think that's my 4 talks. Are there any other? Go ahead. It's certainly something I've thought about right now. If you look at, that could probably, couldn't work with a comment because comments don't show up in the parse tree. But they do in JRuby. So if I rewrote parse tree for JRuby, and I think I'm actually going to add them to Rubinius sometime in the near future. My dream is actually to add positional and comment information into Rubinius so I can write that refactoring browser I've always dreamed of. So no, you can't do that right now, but you can do certain restrictive things. I'm actually running an old version of Heckle on this. But in the new version and in this version, you can restrict what sort of mutations happen. So in this one, I think this is 1.3, you can do branches only. So if you don't care about literals, if you're just really looking for, are these branches being tested, you can just turn those on. In the new version, you can also do per node type on and off. So you can say, I don't care about symbols, I don't care about strings, I don't care about regexes, I do care about calls, that sort of thing. So it's certainly more configurable in the 1.4 series. And we've got a bunch of bug fixes in that right now, so I think 1.4.2 should probably come out next week. So that's Heckle. Other questions about Heckle or just general stuff? Yes. They actually have Heckle integration in our spec. There's a -- Heckle option. And last I checked that was working. If it's not, Aslak Helisoy and Joe O'Brien both promised me they'd work on it a little bit. So, I'll kick them if it's not. So tell me if it's broken. I'm easy to track down. Just Google Kevin Clark or kevin.clark@gmail. I'm boring. I don't have fancy handles.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.